There is a current environmental crisis pertaining global warming, increased extreme weather events, and excessive pollution, which puts the safety and health of humanity at stake. Environmental crisis has been caused by human behaviors like overconsumption, increased use of toxic man-made chemicals in everyday activities, and excess pollution from industries, housing, and transportation. Since the 2000s, the amount of extreme weather incidents have increased significantly. In the last 3 years alone, we have suffered from a total of 26 forms of extreme weather. The consequences of the rising temperature are putting many people and wildlife in danger.
Government agencies and politicians are creating policies and regulations to try to mitigate the effect of human behavior on our environment. They are concerned for the American population and the effects that our current environmental crisis is having on them. We talked to Abby Caden, a policymaker for the Department of Environmental Protection of Pennsylvania. She's in charge of creating all policies and regulations for the environment. She works with stakeholders, engineers, scientists, and companies to see what their needs are and what can be done to help our environment and safety and health of the Pennsylvania population. Abby's going to explain to us what she does in the government.
We work with the program staff, so like the engineers, the geologists, the biologists, the chemists, to essentially get the science down on paper into the world where science meets policy, and if that makes sense, science and government kind of come together. And
Abby is also going to explain to us what a regulation is, the purpose of a regulation, and the process needed to go through in order to create a regulation.
Growing up in high school and in college, you learn how a bill becomes a law, but no one ever explains what a regulation is and how that's a policy. Yeah. So essentially what happens is, a legislative body makes a law, the governor signs it, and it becomes, an effective law. But then, how does a law get implemented? Well, it gives authority to state agencies like mine, Department of Environmental Protection. It gives us authority, the legal authority to permit, to have enforcement actions if someone.
So what is the purpose of a regulation?
That's when we say, okay, well, in order to carry that law out, we need to make regulations. So we find, based on data and, what health impacts are, we'll set limits of certain pollutants. So that's when we start the regulatory process to say, you know what, they can only have this much out, release this amount of carbon dioxide. That's how much we're going to permit them. If they go above that, we're going to fine them, or they're going to need to do a corrective action to fix that. So that's how we create regulations to do that says, formally written down, hey, oil and gas company, these are what you need. You need to do X, Y, and Z to be in compliance.
So how is a regulation made?
So in Pennsylvania, we have the Regulatory Review Act, and that is a very, very strict compared to any other state. It basically says all the things, it's very prescriptive what you need to do throughout the regulatory process.
Let's take a look into this process and the things needed to do in order to create a regulation.
There are 6 main steps in the regulation process. The first step is that we need to identify a need for a regulatory change based on current issues affecting people in the community. The next step is that we need to develop proposed rulemaking documents like research and data to support regulation. Third, we need to obtain input from advisory committees. Fourth, we need proposed rulemaking process by opening regulation to the public. Fifth, we need to prepare final rulemaking documents in response to public comments. And finally, the 6th step is that we need the final rulemaking process, which is the enforcement of the law.
Let's take a deeper look into this process. Abby explains how they find the need for regulatory change.
So in the Regulatory Review Act, it really stresses like stakeholder engagement. So we want to make sure like anyone who's impacted by our regulations has their voice heard. So business says this is going to cost me $100 more a year or a month. We want to know that so that we're not prohibiting business growth, but that we're also protecting the environment and kind of finding that perfect like in between.
Once they find need for regulation, they go into creating the necessary rulemaking documents to create the regulation.
That's when we create the regulation. We work with the program engineers, and usually they're not very good writers, so we have people like me who kind of take their science, write it in a way that's digestible for like your mom to read.
Once they have the necessary documents, they ask their advisory boards for input.
Have like DEP has like over 30 advisory committees, and depending on what the topic is, like there's multiple like advisory committees, and some of the advisory committees that have all the stakeholders on it, sometimes they're like prescribed by law. So in the law where it gives us the authority, sometimes they'll also create like the Solid Waste Advisory Committee must have one representative from like local government, must have one Democratic appointee, one Republican appointee, and so it'll list out, but some of them don't have any kind of like legal requirement, which is where it's kind of up to us to decide who's on it, but we want to make sure everything's fair, so we try to balance everything.
Yeah.
And when we do have, let's say we have the Oil and Gas Technical Advisory Committee, that's made up of people who are somehow have expertise in the oil and gas field. So if they are, people who know the science and know the process and know the industry, we need them to tell us how things work on their end so that we can properly regulate it.
Okay.
But then, but they don't. They advise us, so they don't make decisions. They just give us advice, and then we can take it or leave it. But essentially, we always kind of want their, give us an okay on everything we do, because then you're not going to have a legal battle.
Before the regulation draft can be open to public, it must be approved by an environmental quality board. Abby's going to explain who is in this quality board.
Once we take everything to an advisory committee, it has to go to the environmental quality board, which is made up of the secretary from every agency, so the head of all the state agencies, like the Department of State, Department of Labor and Industry, the Fish and Boat Commission, one from the minority leader and one from the majority leader in both the House and Senate. So it's politically balanced, and then it has every state agency on the board. And essentially we have to present this regulation, we explain everything about it in the nitty-gritty details, and then they vote, this can go out for comment. So we put it out for comment, it goes online, and that's where formally we start documenting any public feedback we get on it.
At this point, they now have a regulation draft ready to be sent for public comment.
Then we release everything publicly for public comment. So my grandma can go and be like, hey, this is good, or say hey, did you consider this study? Usually we put it out to ask, looking for science based, because opinions, while it's helpful to get the kind of the public radar on how they feel about things, it's we're more so looking for things that we can say, well, based on this study that's reputable, peer-reviewed, this backs up the science. The science is how we make our decisions, type of thing. But we have to consider every comment that comes in and respond to each one individually. So if, you want to comment on something, we have to respond to it.
Based on public comment, final changes are made to the regulation, and it is almost ready to be finalized.
That kind of completes the draft regulation, and then when we go back to make it a final and implementable regulation, we take it back to the advisory committee. We say, based on the comments, we did this, and they kind of see everything in the final form, what it will look like, and then it's kind of their last shot to have a voice in it, and then we take it back and we bring it back to that environmental quality board that had like all the state agencies and the political representatives on it, and then they vote, and if it's in the public interest, they approve it essentially, and it goes into effect, usually like a few months later. So